Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
I'm great, thank you.
Good. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're Paul Stephan, a professor at the University of Virginia, more specifically the John C. Jeffries Jr. Distinguished Professor of Law at UVA. You've taught a lot and written a lot about international law. You've served in government in various departments, state, defense, and so on. And you've written a book that we're going to talk about called The World Crisis and International Law. The subtitle is The Knowledge Economy and the Battle for the Future, published by Cambridge University Press. Paul, let me start by telling you why I think the book is important and this conversation is important. And then you can tell me why you think the book is important, because you actually may have a slightly different take on it than I do. So I am somebody who thinks that the further evolution of global governance is critical for the sake of the planet. In my circles, kind of progressive circles, probably the most famous example is climate change, which many people consider an existential problem. I personally think there are, as important as that is, there are a number of other issues that are as close to being existential as that is. Biotech, whether you want to just prevent the next pandemic or prevent terrorists somewhere from genetically engineering and then releasing a bioweapon. I think those things require a certain amount of global governance. If you want to prevent arms race in space, war in space that could have cascading effects and lead to nuclear war. If you want to prevent nuclear war, I mean, all of these things, I think are best done with a certain amount of global governance. And there are other areas. I mean, I could get into AI, cyber war. There's a lot of ways that things could go wrong on a large scale on an integrated planet. And so I'd like to see the further evolution of global governance. And your book is about the fact that things aren't going great for global governance lately. And in particular, one thing that I would call a kind of a sinew of global governance, and actually here you may have a slightly different take, but I would call international law, a very important part of global governance, and respect for it a very important thing. And your book is partly about the fact that there's been a certain erosion of the force of international law in some realms, respect for international law. Now, in addition to all that, you have a kind of a grand unified theory of why international law is in trouble, global governance is in trouble, and that theory, if right, helps explain a lot of things, including the rise of Donald Trump, the rise of figures like Donald Trump around the world. So we'll get into all that. It's a very interesting dimension of your book. But let me just stop there and see if what I've said so far makes sense to you, what you would differ with or change or add by way of setting the context for a discussion of your book.
So, Bob, first of all, thank you for having me on. I've been an admirer of yours since the New Republic days, and oh
my God,
I'm grateful to be here.
So let me just say, whenever we, it doesn't happen that often, but when we approach somebody to be on the podcast and it turns out they've already heard of me, it makes my day, and that happened in this case. So, but let the record show, I thought the book was important enough to feature before I knew that you were familiar with my work. So, but that goes back further than either of us cares to admit, I guess. my days at the New Republic. But anyway, go ahead. I interrupted you.
Sure. So I think we should wear our age gracefully. And as far as your summary, I thought it was excellent. I start at the same point you do, with a belief that most of the important threats facing the world today are collective action problems that require some kind of management, some kind of cooperation among states, that we do not live in a world with a hegemon that can fix it all by itself. And I believe, furthermore, that to be successful, global governance has to rest on fundamental acceptance by all the interested parties. And my concern is that the structures that we erected in the 90s, not the beginning of global governance, but I think a significant add-on to global governance that occurred immediately after the Cold War, was based on misconceptions about the level of support for the ideas on which that governance and the results of that governance, and that we have, over the course of the 21st century, been coming to grips with the growing evidence that the structures we created aren't really well suited for the problems that we face. So my approach is not to denounce global governance, but to see what we can do to improve the structures so that they meet needs. Sorry. And as far as grand unified theory, I would just modify that a little bit. I have some ideas about threads that I see running through all of this, but I wouldn't pretend that it is a powerful theory that explains everything. It's not a theory of everything. It's just something that we need to take into account that I think is important, that explains enough of what's going on in the world that we need to come to grips with it. But I don't pretend that it explains everything.
Yeah, and here we're talking about your emphasis on the knowledge economy, which we'll get into, and how that helps explain some of the backlash against, against networks of international elites, against global governance, and against the kind of liberal international crusade and so on. And it's a very interesting dimension. As far as I'm aware, it's kind of new. I mean, I want to talk about that, the connection between the rise of knowledge economy and globalization and the backlash and so on. So, I think, especially based on what you just said, maybe a good thing to do is start in the 90s and talk about how promising things looked then. As we've established, both of us are old enough to remember. And the Cold War had ended. The part of this that I remember in a way most clearly is the kind of dusting off of the Security Council and the actual use of it by the first Bush administration to authorize a war. It was the Persian Gulf War. Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, so the Persian Gulf War was almost on the face of it a legitimate war in terms of traditional international law, because he had invaded a country. Transborder aggression violates the UN Charter, but to really go through proper channels, Bush went to the Security Council, and because the Cold War was over, it was no longer deadlocked. The Soviet Union wasn't so inclined to veto anything we wanted as it had been once, and so they actually authorized a war, which made it legal, and the war happened, and that was just kind of shocking and new to me. And I started wondering, well, is it possible we're moving toward a world where there's really consistent respect for this part of international law, the part that bans transborder aggression? That's one thing I remember for the 90s. But one thing about your book is it's about all kinds of facets of international law and global governance. I mean, your own background is in tax law, which is, involves more international law than the average person is anywhere near being aware of, probably. But tell me how you remember the 90s, whether you were hopeful, and if so, in a way you now consider naively hopeful, or what?
So, Bob, actually, I have two backgrounds. I'm schizophrenic intellectually. I've from the beginning of my career, I've done tax and I've done Soviet stuff, and then Russian stuff, and those two things came together. It turned out I was both the most and the least qualified person in the world who did both, because there was no one else. So I, during the 90s, was heavily immersed in projects to help the former socialist countries in Europe and Russia more than any other one, to create a tax structure that would be adjacent to a market economy and substitute for the kind of state management of the economy that had existed under the old system. So I was on the ground, and on the one hand, I was working with a wonderful group of people who were economists and tax specialists, not just U.S. Treasury. My immediate boss there was the then Assistant Secretary for International Affairs, a guy named Larry Summers, and the folks from the IMF, from the World Bank, the OECD, were all in on that project. It was a great team. And I was the only guy who had spent a lot of time on the ground in the old Soviet Union. I'd been traveling there for more than a decade. I'd been, got my first paycheck as a Soviet specialist back in 1974 as a CIA political analyst. So I was, excited about the enthusiasm of our masters in the Clinton administration and the a team I was working with. But I was also nervous because I felt I knew something about how the Russians had survived socialism by developing workarounds that were based on cookbooks and corruption and bribery. And I was afraid we weren't taking into account the extent to which people there just assumed that's how the world worked. And we were selling them structures, a disinterested judiciary, for example, which works great if people trust the judges and the judges earn people's trust, not necessarily otherwise. Along with that, there was just an explosion of structures, some economic. The EU was created out of the old European economic communities. The World Trade Organization was created out of the old GATT, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Investor protection took off. NAFTA came into the world. By the end of the decade, we had the International Criminal Court. And I could go on, but there was significant institution building based on the premises of international liberalism, as well as a concept of liberal democracy for states, the idea that all the states in the world wanted to be like the United States, whether they had gotten there or not.
Can I ask you a question about that? I want to ask you, of course, on your take on what went wrong, but I personally think what went wrong may be related to a kind of ambiguity in the phrase liberal internationalism. I had John Eikenberry on the podcast a few years ago, and of course, he coined the term, I think, liberal internationalism, and has written about it extensively. And I said, let me get this straight. Does liberal internationalism, does that refer to the order of rules governing relations among states? Like there should be fairly free flow of trade among them, and they should abide by rules, and there should be, or does it also involve certain ideas about how states should operate internally, that they should themselves be liberal democracies? And he said, actually, different people use the term differently, and I thought, well, that's quite a difference, and there's a big difference between, at the end of the Cold War, saying we want to establish a world governed by law, where relations among states are governed by law, and they collectively address problems that they all face, maybe climate change and so on. And it's in some sense liberal or whatever, but there's a big difference between saying that and saying, oh, and also, we think all countries should be like us internally, and they should be liberal democracies. And if you're like an authoritarian state, that may get in the way of this whole project. Okay. these are two very different things. And my own view is if we had focused on the narrower conception of liberal internationalism and seeing that as job one, we'd be in much better shape now. But you tell me, because I don't think you address that question per se in the book, but it is, but you kind of in another way do. But what would you say about that?
So jumping to the bottom line, Bob, I agree completely with you. And indeed, back in the mid-aughts, I got into a public debate with Mike McFall on exactly this issue. You know, I along with colleagues here at Virginia who had focused on Russia for our careers, thought that American policy, at least one conception of American policy that McFall certainly embodied, misconceived the project by wanting everyone to be like us and using that as the criterion rather than identifying areas of common interest where we could work together without getting into the much more intractable issues of our similarity. I think the conceptual link that led many people to think the two were related was the idea of Immanuel Kant's perpetual peace. A number of people, I hate to say this to you, given your loyal Princeton alumnus status, this was really prevalent at Princeton in particular. I mean, you know, important work was done that sought to document that liberal democracies did not go to war with each other, and ergo, if we have more liberal democracies, there will be less war. That was sort of the calculus.
And you're talking about. Are you talking about like John's work and Anne-Marie Slaughter and so on? John
exactly.
Yeah.
Anne-Marie Slaughter is a friend, a fellow Charlottesvillian, and someone who I greatly respect. But I have disagreed with her from the beginning on, well, at least missing the point. I mean, even if the data is convincing, what it doesn't explore is the greater willingness for liberal democracies to go to war against non-liberal democracies, in part because of incomprehension and partly because of frustration that why aren't they with the program?
Right.
I think the Gulf, not the Gulf War, but the second Gulf War is a great illustration of that.
Well, let me say, I'm a friend of Anne's too, but I disagree with her too. And I remember, I don't know, 15 years ago or so, I was at a small conference here where she was pitching, you know, some kind of League of Democracies thing. And I just want to add
Congress of Democracies, I think
it was called the Congress of Democracies. I just want to add as a footnote that this has wound up being the governing vision of the Biden administration, you know, or a big part of it. This idea that we're in a global war with autocracy. They have this, well, I forget what they call their League of Democracies. They had some meeting, and I don't know how hard they're pushing it, but I just want to put this down as a marker that this is very much a live issue. It has real consequence. And a vision that you and I don't think is the right vision has quite a bit of influence right now, I think, in the White House.
Yeah, well, just to add a footnote, academics add footnotes after all. I think actually the biggest proponent of this concept was actually John McCain, who also injected quite a bit of militarism or militancy, at least, into the idea. And I actually think, although you're absolutely correct that this is one of the ideas influencing the Biden administration, I actually think it is less invested in the idea, partly because there's more reality that's caught up against it than, say, the second Bush administration was. So I think it's still very much a live idea, but I think it's over the course of the 21st century being ground down a bit. There are still people like McFall who I think are, you know, completely committed to it, and I respectfully disagree with him.
Yeah, don't get me started on that subject.
Yeah, well, he ran a program at Stanford that my daughter thrived in, so I can't be too.
Yes, okay. Then any disrespect that's heaped on McFall will come from me. I understand, and I will refrain from that for now. I just will say, he seems to be willing to court a certain amount of existential risk at the moment in Ukraine, in the Ukraine vicinity, in pursuit of the vision we're describing. in other words, he's kind of trying to downplay the concerns that you could wind up in a nuclear war if you're not careful. So let's get back to your story. You were talking about the 90s. Do you want to continue and tell us how you would characterize what went wrong? So you were concerned from the beginning, and you were how would you characterize the concern? So you thought, first of all, there was a certain amount of naivete about how things had been operating in the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc, and just kind of the legacy of decades and decades of kind of, well, authoritarian, autocratic, statist governance, economic governance. What else would you say about what you thought were causes for concern? Or I mean, let me ask you, what would you have done differently about the Soviet Union than was done in terms of our policy with respect to the Soviet Union?
Yeah, well, that's tough. It's easy to be an academic and floating ideas when you actually are in the world of policy, and particularly when you're on the ground, it's much harder. So I would say my headline difference at the time was that I still believe, and wrote a lot about this at the time, that the West did not win the Cold War, rather the Soviet side lost it. That is to say, it was the Soviet model that proved to be a disaster and lost the confidence of everybody. And Gorbachev's great contribution was from the top to see things weren't working. I continue to revere his memory for that fundamental insight. Mm-hmm. I thought that the Washington consensus, which the projects I was working on reflected, did not appreciate the extent to which the belief in markets, property, privatization, all that depended on a certain social glue, what economists call social capital, that just simply wasn't there. So I would have been, if someone was foolish enough to put me in charge of the programs I was working on, I would have just been more cautious. Mm-hmm. I would have gotten more buy-in from our hosts, and in particular, I would one of the things that pervaded those technical assistance programs in the 90s was a kind of implicit deal where we give you travel to the West and computers, and you pretend to listen to us. And you'll even enact laws if we push them hard enough. And you don't worry about enacting those laws because you've got workarounds. That's what cookbooks and corruption are all about. Mm-hmm. So I would have been much less ambitious. Rather than talking about a Marshall Plan, I would be talking about a new détente. I would have tried to find, I certainly, one thing that we did early and didn't do enough of and didn't sustain was funding young people. Identifying talent and giving them a chance either in the West or through institutions that would be built up, to give them the tools to understand alternate approaches to the world, and seeing it as a generational project rather than a quick fix.
Mm-hmm. Let me, I want to ask you to talk about when, what the signs were that things were unraveling from your point of view. Before we do that, I want to put a pin in one more point. You mentioned the World Trade Organization, and in the mid 90s, well, first of all, that became, it became a thing. First of all, before that, there had been the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. There had been nothing. There had been agreements. That's why the A was in there about about tariffs and so on. But there had been nothing like an enforcement mechanism. One thing the World Trade Organization featured that really got my attention was something much closer to, an adjudicatory mechanism with a certain amount of force. I mean, there was a tribunal that nations could appeal to, kind of highest tribunal, and it's not like it sent the police to your country if you were not in compliance with your agreements on trade. but he did authorize the nation that had brought the grievance, if it found that the grievance was valid, to deploy punitive tariffs of a certain magnitude. So that was a kind of, sanctioned punishment for violating the law in a certain sense, and that was it was a real threshold. That's now fallen apart. For one thing, the Trump administration decided to paralyze that adjudicatory body.
Let me interrupt you right
yeah.
there. Just to be clear, it started under the Obama administration, was consummated by the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has done nothing to reverse that. So that's really a bipartisan policy on the part of the United States. We can't hang that on Trump as much as we'd like.
I'm disappointed. I like to hang as much as possible on Trump.
I get it.
Anyway, let me just say, so that's partly by way of showing how much there is to global governance. This is another realm. I've always thought the WTO was a potentially powerful organization. Like if it became this thing where you said, if you want to be a member in good standing of the WTO, you have to comply with, I don't know, the Biological Weapons Convention or something. That'd be a very powerful lever. But that's me in visionary mode. Never mind. We never got anywhere near that. But that was, as of 95, it seems to me, that was kind of a sign of hope. And now you can first of all comment on that if you want, but if not, then just proceed to tell us like how things unraveled, what the big signs were, and so on.
So your characterization of the WTO is exactly right. That it created a permanent court. What existed before was an arbitration mechanism, but the arbitral opinions were advisory only, while under the WTO, the appellate body, as it was called, the permanent court, it was the reverse, that its decisions could be reversed only by the entire membership by consensus. So it looked much more like a real court with real judges, a real jurisprudence. And I think two things happen, and this connects to the sense of unraveling. On the one hand, the 94 agreement that went into effect in 95 was really a take it or leave it deal by the four principal powers, Canada, Europe, the United States, and Japan. And indeed, what they did is they terminated the GATT. So they said to the rest of the world, here's the deal. It's the only deal on the table. Take it on our terms. And the countries that we now call the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, accepted, but grumpily. And by 2008, it was clear that no further progress was going to be achieved. There was an attempt on the regular schedule, the way this system used to work. About every 7 or 8 years, there'd be a new deal called a round of negotiations, and that round collapsed. And it collapsed largely because of a lack of trust in countries in the South with the deal that they had been handed that was very Western-oriented. So that was one problem. And the other problem, and I think this is a pattern you've seen in the international institutions generally, is facing pushback. The people in institutions acting in complete good faith and believing in the worthiness of their project responded by doubling down. And so the appellate body became, I think, somewhat more ambitious in its claims. And as a result, they irritated major parties, including the United States. The EU had their own grievances. But the U.S. was much more vocal and instrumental in responding to them. So my take on all this is sort of the arc of my story, is that the ambitions of 95 were unfounded, or at least not built for the long haul, not built once things started coming apart in the 21st century for a lot of reasons. From the second Iraq war through the financial crisis, the massive immigration challenges that both the U.S. and Europe have faced, all these things and many more, the going south of the cyber world. what I think where we are now is we're essentially back to where we were before the WTO was created. We still have these panels, and we're still using them, including the U.S. Uh, um, and the United States has asserted aggressively a get out of jail free concept under the agreement of the GATT, the original agreement. National security is supposed to be self-judging. And the U.S. has been the country that has most insisted on self-judging. The Trump administration, showed how that concept can be abused by treating, really economic interests as matters of national security. We don't have enough aluminum and steel, and rather than see that as a market problem, we said that's like being at war. But that has not been.
So in other words, we justified tariffs as being required by national security, and that somehow that was
and under
loophole.
The language of the GATT, that's off limits. Except the panels all said, "Well, we don't care what the language says. We're going to review this anyway because what you're doing is ridiculous." Mm-hmm. And so we now have
in other words, under GATT, national security is a legitimate reason to kind of evade what would otherwise be the law. The law, it's a loophole in the law. Trump exploited it, and the WTO panel said, "No, sorry, this is going too far. It's crazy."
I would add, it's not just national security is legitimate, but national security is self-judging.
Right.
I mean, it says that in the language.
It says each country gets to decide. Okay, that's exactly. A big loophole. That's a big loophole.
And it's a huge loophole. And the way up until this century, the way we lived with it is nobody pushed it because they realized it was a threat to the entire system. If anyone has a get out of jail free card, everyone does.
Right.
And things can quickly spiral out of control.
Right.
But we've crossed that Rubicon. We weren't the first, but we were the most consequential. And again, we haven't backed down for that.
And just out of curiosity, what specifically was it that the Obama administration did that led us down this path of, in effect, noncompliance?
So the strategy, which parenthetically actually started under NAFTA, but was followed with respect to the WTO, is you have this limited term judicial body. Mm-hmm. I think it's 7 years, but don't quote me on that. It might be 5. And the U.S. has a veto over replacements. So we starting with the Obama administration, we blocked new appointments to that body in order to call attention to our grievances, and particularly the mission creep that we felt it was guilty of. And the WTO, rather than negotiating with the United States, tried to turn it into a chicken game. And the chicken game proceeded, and it proceeded under Trump, so that we got from not having a quorum to not having anyone on that body. So that
panel is now completely paralyzed. It in effect
it's non-existent.
Yeah.
Or at least it doesn't have people. It only has legal capacities, but no people to exercise them.
And Biden has done nothing about that to reverse the situation. Okay, so proceed then, if you want, or I can ask you another question. If you want to say more about kind of the unraveling, before long we should get to what I'm calling your grand unified theory, and you're not. But what else you want to say about things going? I have my own story in the realm of the issue of transborder aggression, which I'll get to sooner or later, as regular listeners know. But why don't you go ahead?
Yeah,
because that's not the main focus of your book, although you certainly pay attention to it. The law against invading countries.
Yeah. So I think the first real crack in what we saw as a great new international consensus with the first Gulf War. I mean, I would say things started to come apart with the NATO bombing of Serbia in connection with Kosovo.
Right.
Further things developed after that. By the 21st century, you have Russia objecting to events in its near abroad, converting that into military intervention. What from the very beginning of the post-Soviet period, Russia had promoted frozen conflicts on its border. That's to say, security problems that it stoked without letting them boil over into outright war in order to keep neighboring countries off balance, particularly Azerbaijan, Georgia, Moldova. In 2008, we had the first actual use of armed force in Georgia. We saw signs from the beginning of the Obama administration that China was not going to be completely silent on security issues. We had the downing of the American aircraft at the very start of the Obama administration, and then the 9-dash line is a pretty aggressive claim. And then of course the annexation of Crimea, leading up to the current war. I happen to agree with you, at least in general terms, about there being shared responsibility on the part of the West, or at least sort of hubris and inattention that help lead to those conflicts. I think you can say that without forgiving at all Russia's choices. Mm-hmm. In the security sphere, that's what's going on. But my story is there's a similar breakdown of structures meant to promote international trade and investment, which the WTO is part of that story. There are immigration challenges, which have proved to be a real threat to the EU. And I see the EU as one of those 1990s innovations that is under great stress. My friends in Europe say, but luckily Putin has done for us what Stalin did for the European communities. That is to say, give us a reason to cooperate. And people said back in the day that Stalin was the real author of the European communities. And if the EU survives in the next 10 years, maybe we can put up a statue of Putin as the motivation for that. But that could be. I don't pretend to see the future, but I do see a risk that if the EU bails on the Ukrainian war, and more specifically, if Germany bails on the Ukrainian war ahead of others, we might end up in a spiral of recrimination. The Poles and the Balts against Germany that might very well put severe pressures on the EU. We do see increasing participation of far-right governments in states, not in Germany, thankfully. We don't like their history with the far right, but the Front National in France has been a much bigger factor over the course of the century, even though they've yet taken part in government. We do have right-wing governments in many Nordic countries, Italy. Estonia had not in the latest election, but before. We worry about the EU coming undone. And then there is pandemics, there is global warming and climate change, and there is cyberspace, all of which have revealed themselves in this century to be reproaches to our optimism about the future. I mean, you can look at the Arab Spring as a point where the color revolutions came to die, where we were so optimistic about or at least some were. I actually wasn't, but many were optimistic. This just shows our internet-powered democracy defeating autocracy. And it's hard to look at what's happened since 2011 with respect to the Arab Spring and saying, the thugs won, and a lot of the reasons why they won is because their superior surveillance capabilities trump the organizational capabilities that the cyber gave the people fighting from below.
Yeah. That just to touch on that for 1 second, is there? I mean, in my mind, that battle has kind of yet to play out. I mean, in particular, I think it remains to be seen whether China, in so aggressively deploying the digital technology to authoritarian ends is ultimately going to pay an economic price for that. You know, to what extent is that kind of top-down control compatible with prosperity? I mean, I once thought that the answer would be it's not. I'm not so sure, but I also think the jury is out. So I don't, and I think that could lead possibly to a loosening. The pendulum could swing. I don't know about that. I'm curious as to your view about that, but I'm also curious about, like, is there anything, what can international law or global governance do about that particular thing that worries you, which is to say the authoritarian use of cyber stuff? It's not obvious to me that there's a lot you can do in that realm, but
yeah. So I'm actually a sunny and optimistic person, even though I believe in looking threats in the face. And I believe maybe more out of conviction than out of evidence that top-down economic management is not the right solution to any configuration that I can imagine in the world. And I think President Xi has given us some evidence as to the limitations of top-down unaccountable decision making. So I agree the jury is out, but I think that the optimism, the summer love feeling that got attached to the internet, the idea that we would have a new form of popular democracy that would keep the bad guys from good people realizing their intrinsically wonderful nature. I think that concept there's a lot of evidence in validating that concept. So what kind of compromise do we have? Will be a challenge. And I have some thoughts on that go beyond what's in the book. If all goes well, maybe it'll be my next project. But I would just say that, in general, I would like to see countries exploring ways that they can demonstrate in a kind of learning by doing way, desirable, not necessarily optimal, but desirable responses to serious problems, in the hopes that others will imitate them. And to take cyber as one example, the surveillance problem, I think, is extremely hard to come to a collaborative medium with, particularly because I think there's such a deep tension between the desirability of having big databases and the harm that abuse of these databases can be used to allow states to perpetuate themselves in power, as well as to impose tangible harms on people who have things that they want to keep secret and should keep secret. So that's a big problem. But I think I use as an example ransomware and malicious use of cyber. I can see a consensus emerging, not a universal consensus, but a consensus that some of these things really are not worth what they cost. Ransomware, for example. I mean, the North Korean government keeps itself afloat with ransomware. And I'm prepared to believe that their Chinese allies would agree that keeping North Korea afloat is not a legitimate reason for allowing ransomware to be used, given what a risk it imposes to an increasingly cyber-connected world. So we might develop, it couldn't be written down in treaties, but we might develop practices where states kind of get a free pass at taking down ransomware actors, and their home states don't get in the way and maybe even cooperate behind the scenes in bringing down ransomware actors. I can see that equilibrium evolving. Indeed, I'd say that maybe we're not that far away from that equilibrium, although this goes on in secret, so we don't know if it's really happening. That's an example.
So that's an example where you think the solution is a little more normative than legal. Is that right? I mean, at the international level,
right?
And is that something that the feasibility of which depends on kind of the state of international harmony? In other words, would you imagine that a deepening Cold War makes that kind of thing less likely?
Sure. So the way I would put it, I think the way at least some jurisprudence and lawyers talk about this is the difference between formal and informal law enforcement and cooperation. So if you got a court, that's pretty formal. And if you have a system that is enforced instead by tit for tat and other forms of cooperation, like the GATT was before the appellate body, it's still law and it's still law enforcement, but it's not the kind of black robe kind of law that we sort of see as the center of the system. And I actually think that we pay too much attention to formal law and not enough to the kind of cooperative behaviors that build social trust. And I think social trust is the fundamental coin of the realm. A Cold War destroys Cold War social trust because it's a barrier to understanding. I mean, even people of good intention that are simply trying to comprehend the other side are accused, as you well know, of actually being the allies of the other side. So we need less of that and more trial by error that demonstrates. Now, a wonderful example of this, I think, is the Paris Pact for climate change, where we combine some formal legal commitments with respect to transparency as to what we're doing with complete informality as to the content of our decarbonization commitments. Every state can set for themselves their goals. That's as informal as you can get, but they have to be completely transparent about that. And if you are optimistic and believe there are technological fixes, it gives states an incentive to partially because the fixes can be monetized, they can be sold to others. This is an environment that encourages states to explore ways of decarbonization without having the perhaps misplaced incentives of having to meet a schedule set from above that can't be easily adapted to reflect changes in the world.
So it on the one hand makes it easier to kind of shame nations in a certain sense. You've established a standard and you can say this nation, failed to meet the standard, even though there's no legal compulsion. There's no way of enforcing the expectation that they would meet the standard. And then on the other hand, it's also an opportunity for nations to be performative in a good way, to virtue signal and say, look, we met our standard. We're and don't you wish you were like us, right? I mean, that's in your mind, that's kind of the main importance of things like Paris and Glasgow.
Yeah, I would say I would maybe use slightly different vocabulary there. I mean, the problem with virtue signaling is that it implies that somebody else is not virtuous. I would rather say a preference for cooperation and reliability.
So now this points to one interesting thing about your worldview. So you say, a lot of work can be done by norms, in effect, not laws, and kind of traditions of respect for implicitly or explicitly agreed upon rules. And really, and first of all, I mean, I kind of agree that we should always get as much done without legal compulsion as possible in general in life. It's better, but also because the idea of kind of, this thing that one reason I use the word global governance as opposed to say world government is I don't imagine some kind of centralized world government ever existing, but also that term just freaks people out. So for that reason too, you'd like to get as much done without legal compulsion as possible, because legal compulsion gets people worried about national sovereignty and all kinds of things. And I'm interested in the question of how much you can and can't do with norms, and I'm interested in your view of the relationship between laws and norms. For somebody who's written a whole book about international law and kind of bemoaning threats to it, you're actually, in a certain sense, not a big believer in international law. In other words, I think you see it as something that very often, rather being kind of the source of of compliance, or the thing that, the thing that forces compliance, more a reflection of informal relationships that lead to compliance, if that makes sense. I mean, there is, at one extreme, in terms of views of international law, there are people who dismiss it as mere epiphenomenon. You hear this from libertarians sometimes, who aren't big on it at all. And they say, whatever it's international law is never doing any actual work. If there's a treaty and two nations are complying with it, it means they would have been doing roughly the same thing if you hadn't bothered with the treaty. That's one view. I don't think that's quite your view, but you do have a somewhat limited view of this, in a certain sense, of the significance of international law per se. Can you kind of clarify what your view is?
Sure. So first, maybe quibbling about terminology, but roughly 20 years ago, I wrote another book with my revered mentor and once colleague, Bob Scott at Columbia University, where we talked about international law enforcement, drawing on Bob's great reservoir as probably the leading contract theorist in America, among American legal academics. And the idea is it's all law. But we have different enforcement mechanisms, and sometimes formal enforcement is actually counterproductive, not the least because a lot of things that on which cooperation relies are not detectable by third parties, or when they are detectable, can't be proved to a third party dispute resolver. So, if you're using best efforts in a contract, it's kind of hard to prove reliably what best efforts are being used, although a counterparty in a contract can observe and probably tell, even though they can't prove. But there are other ways, based on repeat dealing, which nation states are always in a repeat dealing relationship with each other. So there are ways of building trust, increasing visibility of behavior that don't depend on what I'll call the black robe solution. So and one way to capture this is to talk about law and norms. That is to say, the norms are binding, but they're also sufficiently open-ended that we can't really tell whether they've been met until the future reveals itself. And even then, they're very hard to apply by a disinterested person. But we can tell whether someone is actually behaving consistently with certain norms or not. And that's, I think, my big picture image of international law. So we don't necessarily need the judges and the lawyers to have international law, but I do believe in and I also should add, I am somewhat Marxist in the sense that I think that base dominates superstructure, but I'm not a pure enough Marxist to think that that makes superstructure irrelevant. There is a body of thinking in international relations that talks about, the field is called constructivism, and the idea is we don't really know what we think until people think for us. And so the ideas that are expressed give us targets, and it's the ideas rather than the fundamental conditions that we're dealing with that inspire us to certain directions. That's not my point of view, although I try and take on board people who see the world that way. I do think that law is a useful tool for building trust. If we've got a target, we can tell whether people meet that target. And if they do or don't, we can take that on board and know whether we want to deal with them in the future or not, limit our dealings with them in the future or extend our dealings with them in the future. So that's the role I think that law takes. And so it is a positive contribution, even though, the underlying economic, social, cultural conditions are doing most of the work. I don't think you get law until we're ready for law. Okay. As opposed to the idealists that believe if you believe it, if you build, if you believe in it, it will come. They will come. The field of dreams conception of law. I reject that.
Right. So, a constructivist, what would be a concrete example of something a constructivist would explain in a particular way?
So a lot of the energy in that field, particularly among legal academics, has been in the human rights world. The
Okay.
idea is that once we come up with a widespread conception of bad behavior, no one wants to be seen as a bad actor. I mean, it's not that people have states have a particular preference for or against a particular kind of bad behavior, whether it's fiddling with elections or torturing your adversaries. It's that no one wants to be seen as the bad guy, as the deviant, the outsider. And so the more you are convinced that other people view the world this way, the more you will conform to their expectations.
Well, isn't that just kind of uncontroversially the way norms work, or am I missing something?
So that is one account, but I don't think it's controversial that norms can work that way. But I think it doesn't. I think it's incomplete because it doesn't take into account why people might not care how other people think of them.
Yeah.
I mean, let me give you a counterexample from my world. The anti-bribery practice. The United States, for over 20 years, was alone in the world in sanctioning bribe payers. And interestingly, we didn't go after bribe takers because that means picking our friends among foreign politicians. Rather, we went after bribe payers and thinking that bribe paying was a net loss to the world economy. And during the Cold War, it also was it fed into our adversaries' narrative, that global capitalism was really a corrupting and a manipulative program. But for 20 years, we did that, even though that meant sanctioning companies that belonged to other countries in ways that other countries thought might not be consistent with international law. But we believed anti-bribery is a good thing, and we're going to stick to our guns. And we were sufficiently successful that at the turn of the century, at the end of the 90s, not the start, there was first a treaty and then real practice. It's still kind of limited to a few governments, but it's no longer the U.S. alone. And I think the anti-bribery norm has gotten much stronger in the course of the 21st century. All that was done without a top-down agreement followed by practice. It was U.S. demonstrating that you can do it, that it's a good thing to fight bribery, and others saying, okay, we'll do that too.
Okay. I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little about the what I called your grand unified theory. We've alluded to it, but haven't really gotten into it in much depth. And that's the thing that explains some of the backlash to international law, global governance, and some of the kind of nationalist populism we've seen around the country. And that has to do with the knowledge economy. You want to talk a little about the dynamics of that?
Yeah, let me be pretty brisk about this and therefore, not going into depth. But, the premise is that we live in a world where talent is increasingly rewarded, where talent is an input in production to a far greater extent. It's always been around in the world, but it's just a bigger deal now. And for reasons we don't have time to go into now, the economics of knowledge are such that it leads to returns to scale, which means bigger producers are more efficient. And therefore, we end up in a world where we have at least temporary monopoly providers or something close to it, of concentrated firms that produce concentrated wealth, which is problem one. And the other is in a world where we are committed to talent as a good thing. There is a tendency to say, okay, if you're untalented, you're engaged in bad behavior. And we certainly objectively live in a world where the distinction between the life opportunities for talented and for untalented people are the gap is growing. To say good things about Princeton economists, Case and Deaton's work has just been very powerful in documenting this. And among the losers, who are populists, now looking at inside countries, and particularly rich countries, the losers resent it, and they resent some of the commitments of the winners, not the least being the commitment to talent means necessarily an anti-discrimination principle, or at least no discrimination that is not related to talent. But on the other hand, discrimination against the untalented is at the core of the knowledge economy, and that I think is one area where the losers' resentment has been strongly expressed. Another is labor mobility, for lots of reasons, is an input in the knowledge economy. We want the smart people to go where they go best, and we want poor people to serve them, which often means poor people with insecure legal rights who will work for less. Again, the untalented see themselves being displaced, and therefore there's a strong anti-immigration component among the losers. So these are two of the factors that create political instability, certainly in the rich West, and I think lurking in the rising South as well. And instability in the rich West encourages insurgent revisionist, I should say, states in the South to be more ambitious in their claims. I mean, that's a thumbnail sketch of the dynamics that I think are going on.
So this dynamic is, I think already evident to a lot of people as manifest in the United States. You have, the kind of driving energy behind Trump consisted in no small part of people that you would say don't come out well in the knowledge economy, and people are aware of it in Europe. I think of there being something kind of similar, but you're suggesting that the same dynamic, whether or not it's yet evident to people, is in play around the world. I mean, even in China, you have migration of knowledge workers to the city. And then you also have migration to the city of people who can meet their needs, who can build their buildings. In America, these would be people wielding the leaf blowers, in affluent neighborhoods and so on. And in America, of course, a lot of them would be immigrants. In China, they wouldn't be.
Oh, but they are. They're from the countryside, and they don't have full permits to live where they're working. So they are very much in the same legal status as are undocumented aliens.
Okay, legally. So legally, you can be a Chinese citizen and yet, by virtue of the way their system works, not have all the rights we might assume any citizen of any country has, or
have none of the rights that are associated with the citizen in a social welfare state.
Okay.
You don't have childcare. You don't have easy access to the food. You are tied to your employer in a condition of indentured servitude. It's a system developed by the Soviets with their limitchiki, the limited passports, and the Hoku system in China that produces the same outcome.
So you would expect to see the same kind of backlash there against globalization, global governance. It may not be so evident, in part because now that we have a Cold War descending, there's less in the way of networking of international elites for them to object to, I guess, and less in the way of forceful global governance, and because of the kind of nationally unifying effect of external hostility, which is what they see now when they look at the United States. So this may not be so evident, and it's something I had never really thought about. I had never really thought about the comparison between this dynamic in China and the thing that got Trump elected. But you're saying we should expect to see a kind of a global, as time proceeds, an ongoing global resistance to this particular part of globalization, the kind of global governance part. Is that right?
Yeah, so I think every country, every political culture is different, and the way these conflicts will be worked out will look differently. And I wouldn't suggest that China is ripe for Trumpian politics or anything like that. What I say in the book is I describe what the world looked like to me in Shenzhen, where I've spent a lot of time, and where, China's export economy first really grew. And if I were President Xi and I was aware of what I saw all around me there, it would keep me up at night.
Mhm.
I mean, maybe we can keep these countryside people who are now engaged in dangerous and exhausting physical labor. Maybe we can keep them down, but maybe not. And how the conflict will emerge is very hard to say. All I'm saying is that there are tensions that around the world. Look at Modi, look at Bolsonaro. To some extent, look at Putin, they are certainly in Russia. The elite hostility of the people who got rich in the 90s is a huge part of the politics of that world.
Mhm. Okay. So listen, we've been talking about an hour, and that's usually where I draw it to a close. Now, one thing we've been doing lately is sometimes taking a conversation into kind of overtime and making that part available to paid subscribers of the Nonzero newsletter, and anyone can become one of those by going to the Nonzero Substack site. And needless to say, we encourage it. So I'd like to do that with you. And you've said you have time to kind of go into overtime. But before we do that, before we close out the publicly available part of this conversation, I wanted to give you a chance to say anything else you want to say about the book. I mean, I should say you have recommendations at the end. One of them is don't get too ambitious. There's a certain amount you can hope to accomplish via incrementalism and so on. But anyway, people should certainly take a look at the book if they want to know how to solve the problem we've described, or at least your take on that. Is there anything else you want to say about the book before we proceed to part two of the conversation?
I think you've summed it up very well, Bob, and I appreciate your having me on to talk about it.
Well, you deserve it. Let me say again that it's called The World Crisis in International Law, the Knowledge Economy and the Battle for the Future. You are the author, Paul Stephan. And are there other places people can you direct people to see your work, or?
Yeah, so I have, in connection with the book, I've never written a book like this before. That is to say, one for a general audience. And so one of the things I did is create a website, a personal website, which is partly about the book, but it's partly about me. And the website is www, of course, paulbstephan.com.
Okay. I encourage people to go there. I also encourage people, if they would like to join us in the second part of the conversation, which you can do via the Substack site. But in any event, thanks to everybody for sticking around this long, and congratulations on the book, Paul.
Thank you, Bob.